When her father died, Margaret Hale was 56 years old, and she had nothing. Not in the way people say they have nothing when they mean things are hard. She meant it the exact way. No savings, no property, no plan. She had spent 14 years as her father's caretaker, first for his knees, then for his lungs, then for the long, slow unwinding of his mind that the doctors called dementia, but that felt to Margaret like losing someone one room at a time, one name at a time, until the last room went dark. She had given up her apartment in Columbus to move into his farmhouse outside Millhaven, Ohio. She had given up her office manager job, which she had been good at, because you cannot be in two places at once, and her father had needed someone there. Her two brothers, Dennis and Carl, had not moved. They had sent cards at Christmas and called on birthdays and driven down twice a year with their families and eaten at the table and talked about what they would do if something happened to Dad. And then they had driven back to their lives in Cincinnati and Cleveland and left Margaret to handle whatever happened. She handled it for 14 years, and then her father died in his own bed in late March, with Margaret holding one hand, and within 6 weeks her brothers had presented her with paperwork she did not fully understand, and a check for $8,000 and the news that the farmhouse and the land it stood on had been, through arrangements she had not known about, titled in all three names, and that by majority decision they were selling. Dennis had said she would be taken care of. He had said it standing in the driveway, not looking at her. $8,000 was her share of the proceeds after the sale closed. She signed because she did not know what else to do, and because she was 56 and tired, and she had believed, until the moment the pen touched the paper, that her brothers were the kind of people who would not do this. She was wrong. What she did not know yet was what her father had left behind, not in the farmhouse, but in the old mill house 2 miles up the valley road, the one that had been in the family since before Margaret was born, and that nobody, not Dennis or Carl or the lawyer or the buyer, had ever thought to mention. And behind the cellar wall of that mill house, behind 40 years of stacked limestone and silence, was the reason her father had never worried about her. He had simply never told her. We're glad you're here for this one. If stories like this mean something to you, a subscription helps us keep going. It only takes a moment. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We love knowing. Now let's go back to Margaret. Her father's name was Robert Hale, and he had been, by the standards of Laurel County, a man of modest prosperity and considerable stubbornness, in roughly equal parts. He had farmed the same 212 acres his grandfather had broken, and he had done it without complaint and without praise, which was the way men of his generation and his county tended to approach work. He had a saying that Margaret remembered from childhood: "You don't wait for anyone to notice. You just do it right and let the field speak." He said this about the corn, and the soybeans, and the fence lines, and the tractor engine he had rebuilt in the barn over 2 winters in the mid-1980s, and later, when Margaret was old enough to understand that he meant it as a general principle, she realized he applied it to everything. He was not a man who explained himself. He was a man who acted and trusted that the result would be self-evident to anyone paying attention. Margaret's mother had died when Margaret was 29. A stroke. Sudden. The kind that gives no warning. After that it was Robert and his 3 children. And the farm, and the mill house 2 miles up the road that had once been a working grist mill, and that Robert had bought at a county auction in 1977 for $600, because no one else had bid on it. He had said at the time that he bought it because the stone walls were sound, and it would make a good equipment shed. And it did function as an equipment shed for a time. Margaret remembered old implements stored there in her childhood, a rusted tedder, hay rakes that had not been used in a decade. But her father had also done other things to the mill house over the years. Quietly, she had not paid close attention. There was always something else to pay attention to on a farm. Dennis was the oldest, 4 years older than Margaret, and he had left Laurel County at 22 to study business in Cincinnati and had not come back in any permanent sense since. He was competent and presentable and had a habit of summarizing complicated situations in a single sentence that was usually accurate but never quite complete. Carl was 2 years younger than Margaret and worked for a logistics company in Cleveland and had the manner of a man who makes decisions quickly and does not like to revisit them. They were not bad men. Margaret had told herself this many times in the years after, and she believed it in the way you believe something that is technically true but does not explain the thing that happened. They were men who had built their own lives at a distance and had come to think of their father's land as an asset that existed in another column from their daily lives, to be settled when the time came. The time came on a Thursday in March, and the settling happened faster than Margaret had imagined possible. She had assumed grief would slow things down. It did not slow her brothers down. Dennis arrived the following Monday, Carl on Wednesday, and by Friday there was a lawyer present at the kitchen table of the farmhouse that Margaret had lived in for 14 years, and there were documents. She had known the land was in all 3 names. She had not known, had not thought to ask, had been too tired to ask, had trusted that family meant something different from what it turned out to mean, that this made her outvotable. 2 to 1. The lawyer was not unkind. He simply explained the math. Dennis said she would be taken care of. Carl looked at his phone. Margaret signed. She was out of the farmhouse in 4 weeks, because the buyer wanted a fast close, and her brothers had agreed to accommodate that. She rented a room in Millhaven at a weekly rate from a woman named Patty Greer, who ran a tidy house on Elm Street and who had known Margaret's mother and who did not ask questions and brought coffee to the door in the morning on her way to her own kitchen. Margaret had $83 in her checking account after the security deposit. She had the $8,000 check from the sale, which she had not yet deposited, because depositing it felt like agreeing that it was fair, and she was not ready to agree that. She had a car and 2 suitcases of clothes and a ceramic mug her father had given her years ago. Blue, hand-thrown, with a small imperfection in the lip where the clay had folded just before it set. He had found it at a church ramp sale for 50 cents and brought it home and set it on the kitchen counter and said, "You look like someone who needs a good mug." She had used it every morning since. She had not left it in the farmhouse. She had also, without knowing quite why, kept the key ring she had found in her father's nightstand drawer when she was clearing his room. It was a plain steel ring with 3 keys on it. 2 of them she had identified. The small one opened a tin box in the closet that held his Army discharge papers and her mother's wedding ring, and a piece of paper with a handwritten list of account numbers that she had already given to the estate. The 3rd key was longer and heavier than the others, old, with a bow that was shaped differently from any modern key she recognized. She had not found what it opened. She had put the ring in her coat pocket and forgotten about it until she was sitting in Patty Greer's room on the 2nd night, turning things over in her hands the way you do when you cannot sleep. She knew about the mill house. Everyone in the family knew the mill house existed. But she had not been there in at least 12 years, and she had not thought about it since Dennis and Carl and the lawyer had gone through the property inventory. And it occurred to her now, sitting in the dark on the edge of a rented bed with her father's key ring in her hand, that no one had mentioned the mill house. She was almost certain of this. She went back through the afternoon in her memory, through the papers and the notarized signatures and Dennis's summarizing sentences, and she was quite certain the mill house had not come up. She did not know if this mattered. She was too tired to know. She set the key ring on the nightstand and lay down and slept. In the morning she asked Patty Greer, over the coffee that appeared at the door, whether the old mill house up the valley road from the Hale farm had been sold along with the rest of the land. Patty considered this. She said she thought the mill house sat on a separate parcel. She thought she remembered that, from something she had heard years ago, something about how Robert Hale had bought it at auction separate from the farm ground and had never combined the parcels because of some issue with the road easement. She said Margaret should check with the county recorder's office. Margaret drove to the county recorder's office that morning. The woman behind the desk was patient and thorough and pulled the parcel records in under 10 minutes. The millhouse parcel, 1.8 acres including the structure, the mill race channel, and the small outbuilding behind it, was recorded separately from the farm. It was not in all three names. It was in Robert Hale's name alone, and it had not been included in the estate sale, which meant it had not been sold, which meant it had passed by the terms of her father's will, the same will the lawyer had read, the same will Dennis had summarized as straightforward to Margaret as sole heir for personal property not jointly held. The lawyer had mentioned this briefly. Margaret had been in the room. She had heard the words and had not understood what they attached to. She understood now. She drove the 2 miles up the valley road that afternoon. She had not told her brothers. She did not feel the need. The mill house sat back from the road on a rutted gravel track, screened by old sycamores that dropped their bark in patches and let the light through in pieces. The stone structure was 2 stories. The lower story cut halfway into the hillside, the upper story rising above it with 3 small windows facing the road. The mill race had not run water in decades and was overgrown with cattails and red-twig dogwood. The roof was metal and old but not failing. She could see that much from the track. The wooden door to the upper level was padlocked, a modern padlock she did not have a key for. Around the back, set into the base of the hillside, was a second entrance. A low wooden door, not quite 4 feet tall, framed in stone and set into the foundation wall. This door was not padlocked. It was held by an iron hasp with a long, old key-fitting lock worked into the hasp itself. A mortise lock, she would learn later, the kind built into furniture and doors before knob locks became standard. The key in the bow was the same profile as the 3rd key on her father's ring. She stood in front of that low door for a moment. The afternoon was gray and cool, and a red-winged blackbird was calling from the cattails in the mill race. She took the key ring from her coat pocket. She put the 3rd key into the mortise lock. It turned. If you're with us this far into Margaret's story, we're grateful. Go ahead and subscribe if you haven't. It takes 1 second, and it keeps these stories alive. Now hold on, because what was behind that door is the part her father never spoke of, and it's the part that mattered most. The door opened inward, into the dark, and Margaret had to duck to get through it. She pulled out her phone and used the flashlight. The space inside was the original mill cellar. She understood this from the low stone ceiling and the thick walls and the floor of packed earth that was dry despite being set into the hillside, which meant the drainage was well built, which meant someone had thought about this a long time ago. The cellar was roughly 30 feet long and 15 wide. On the left side, the old millstone still sat in its race housing, covered by a piece of canvas. On the right side were wooden shelves, empty. At the far end was the wall. It was a stone wall, not the original foundation. The original foundation wall was visible on either side of it, and this wall was set in front of it, added later, built from limestone chunks that matched the surrounding stone closely enough that you might not notice it as a separate construction, unless you were looking. The mortar was different. Slightly paler, slightly smoother, finer sand mix. Margaret noticed it because she had spent enough years living in old stone buildings to know what original mortar looked like. And this was not original mortar. This wall was perhaps 3 feet thick and floor to ceiling, and it ran the full 15-foot width of the cellar, completely blocking what would have been the back third of the space. There was no door in it, no seam, just a wall, built by someone who had known what they were doing, in a cellar that no one was supposed to come back to. Her father had built with stone. She knew this. He had rebuilt the farmhouse's spring house entirely in limestone one summer when she was in high school, and she had watched him work. He had a mason's hammer and a cold chisel, and he fit each stone by hand, tapping and checking and tapping again, and when it was done it looked as though it had been there since the beginning. She stood in the cellar with the phone flashlight on the wall, and she knew, without being told, that her father had built this. She knew the way you know certain things about the people you have spent your life beside. She drove back to Patty Greer's house and called a mason named Al Burdett, whose name she found on a card tacked to the bulletin board at the feed store in town, which was still the way you found people in Laurel County. Al came the next morning. He walked the cellar, running his hand along the face of the wall, and then he stepped back and looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then he said, "This was built to come back down." He said it simply, the way a professional states a fact. He said the stones had been laid dry on the interior, no mortar between them, only on the face, which meant the wall would hold its shape from the outside, but could be disassembled from the inside if you knew that, one stone at a time, without tools. He said someone had built an access into it, disguised as solid construction. He said he could take it apart carefully or quickly, and asked which she preferred. She said carefully. It took Al and his nephew 3 hours to bring the wall down one stone at a time and stack the stones neatly to the side. Margaret sat on the millstone housing and watched. She did not help. Al did not ask her to. His nephew, who was 19 and did not say much, handled the heavier stones with a strap and took careful steps and set each one down without noise, which Margaret appreciated. When the wall was down, the back third of the cellar was a room. A dry, cool, sealed room that had been closed, by the look of the mortar on the face of the wall, for something close to 25 or 30 years. Al estimated this by the oxidation on the stone faces, by the undisturbed dust on the floor on the room side, by the particular dry stillness that collects in a sealed space over decades. The room was lined on 3 sides with built-in shelving, the same careful joinery as the shelves on the other side of the wall. On the shelves were stacked wooden trays, the kind used for drying and storing seeds, each one labeled in her father's handwriting with a species name and a year. Corn varieties, 6 of them, with years going back to 1961. Bean varieties, pole beans, shell beans, varieties she did not recognize. Squash, melon, tomato, dozens of labeled paper envelopes in the seed trays, each one carefully sealed and waxed, and behind the seed trays, on the lowest shelf running along the back wall, a row of glass canning jars sealed with wax, and in each jar, visible through the glass, more seeds, the densest collections, the most labeled, the most organized, stored in the most protected way. Against the left wall of the room, on a separate shelf unit, there were 3 metal strongboxes, the kind with combination locks, and on the right wall, hung on a wooden peg, was a canvas work apron, and in the chest pocket of the apron, folded twice, was a letter in her father's handwriting, written on 3 pages of notebook paper, dated 15 years earlier. She read it standing in the room. Al Burdett and his nephew waited outside. Her father had written, "I am writing this in case I am not here to explain it myself, which I expect will be the situation, because I am not a man who has ever managed to explain things at the right moment. I am better at doing than talking, and I know that has cost me. What is in this room is what I have been doing for 31 years. He had been, the letter explained, collecting seed, not casually. He had started in 1961 with 6 open-pollinated corn varieties that his own father had grown and that were already disappearing from the county, displaced by hybrid seed that had to be bought fresh every year and that could not be saved true. He had seen what was coming. He had kept his father's varieties going in a test plot at the back of the north field every year, selecting the best ears, drying them right, storing them right. And then he had started finding other things. A pole bean from an old woman in Meigs County who was the last person growing it. A winter squash from a family in Hocking Hills that had grown it for 4 generations. A tomato so particular to the soil of this river valley that the county extension agent had told him it was commercially worthless, which he had treated as a recommendation to keep it. He had been doing this for 31 years in the back third of the millhouse cellar with a stone wall in front of it. He had told nobody. He had not told his wife, because she would have worried about him spending the time on it. He had not told his sons, because... And here, he had crossed out a sentence and started again, because Dennis and Carl had always seemed to him to be men who calculated value in a particular way, and he was not confident they would understand the value of this. He had not told Margaret, which was the one thing in the letter he said he was sorry for. He said, "I should have told you. You would have understood." The strong boxes, the letter said, held cash, seed sale proceeds from 14 years of quiet selling to specialty growers, heirloom seed companies, and university extension programs that had been looking for exactly what he had. A man from Ohio State had driven down 3 times. A seed library in Vermont had written letters. He had sold carefully and not often, and had taken only what he thought was fair, and had put all of it in the strong boxes because he did not trust banks with money he had made this quietly. He gave the combination in the letter. He said, "This is yours, not the farm. I know that's gone wrong. But this is yours, and it was always meant to be." Margaret sat down on the packed earth floor of the room, next to the letter, and stayed there for a while. Outside, she could hear the red-winged blackbird. She could hear the sycamores in the small wind off the valley. She could hear Al Burdett saying something low to his nephew, and the nephew's answer. And then quiet. The combination in her father's letter opened all 3 boxes. The total in the 3 strong boxes came to $44,200 in mixed bills, bundled and labeled by year in the careful way her father had done everything. She counted it twice, sitting on the floor of the sealed room, in the light from her phone. She drove back to Patty Greer's and sat at the kitchen table, and Patty put coffee in front of her without asking, which was exactly right, and Margaret told her what she had found, most of it, and Patty sat and listened and said at the end, "Your father was a good man." Margaret said she knew. She said she was just beginning to understand how good. She called Dennis the following week, not to explain, not to accuse, not to make a case. She called because he was her brother, and because their father was 2 months dead, and because she thought he should know that she was going to be all right. She told him she had sorted out the millhouse situation, and that she planned to keep it and work with what was there. Dennis said he had not known about the millhouse. He said it in a way that made her think he was telling the truth. He asked what was there. She said their father had left something behind. She said it was enough. There was a silence on the line, the particular kind of silence that happens when someone is reorganizing what they thought they knew. And then Dennis said, quietly, he always knew what he was doing, didn't he? She said yes. She said he did. She thanked him for calling on her birthday last year and said she hoped the kids were well, and ended the call. That was the last time it was mentioned. By the following spring, Margaret had opened the mill house fully. The upper floor turned out to hold the original milling equipment, still intact, which a man from the Agricultural History Society drove 2 hours to look at and said was one of the best preserved examples in the county. She did not sell it. She let him photograph it. She began planting the seed varieties in the back field of the millhouse parcel, a small field, less than an acre, cut out of the hillside meadow by someone long ago, and still clear and south-facing, and good. She grew the 6 corn varieties in isolation plots the way her father had done, selecting the best ears in the fall, drying them on the old wooden trays, labeling them in her own handwriting beside his. The man from Ohio State Extension came back. His name was Gerald, and he was the same man who had driven down to see her father, and when she showed him the seed room, he went quiet for a long time, and then said this collection was something that had been hoped for and not found for 20 years in this part of the state. He said some of these varieties no longer existed anywhere else in any documented collection. He said this carefully, factually, the way her father would have said something. She liked him immediately. Al Burdett had a brother-in-law named Pete, who ran a small seed cleaning operation out of his garage in Laurel County, and Pete came and looked at the equipment in the upper floor and said the stone mill mechanism was restorable, and that there was a market, small but real, for stone-ground cornmeal from open-pollinated varieties, if she was interested. She was interested. Pete knew everyone who grew heritage grain in a 3-county area, and they knew everyone who sold at farmers markets and supplied restaurants in Columbus and Athens that cared about this kind of thing. It was a small world, but it was a real one. She left a bag of dried beans on Pete's porch one morning, without being asked. She had more than she could use from the first harvest of her father's pole bean variety, and Pete had mentioned his wife put up beans every fall. She left them without a note. She did not know if this was a thing her father had done, but it felt correct, in the way that some things feel correct before you understand why, like moving into a habit that was already shaped for you by someone who came before. She moved into the upper floor of the mill house in October, 3 months after she had found it. The space needed work, the windows needed reglazing, there was no insulation in the walls above the stone foundation, and the kitchen was essentially a cast-iron camp stove and a deep utility sink from the 1940s that she thought was beautiful and was not going to replace. She bought a cord of wood and stacked it herself along the east wall where the overhang would keep the rain off. She borrowed a space heater from Patty Greer for the coldest nights. She spent evenings at the kitchen table with the camp stove burning and the seed trays spread out around her, working through her father's catalog, cross-referencing his handwritten labels with what she could find in old agricultural bulletins from the County Extension Library in Millhaven, which the librarian, a quiet woman named Joyce who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain, helped her access from the stacks. Joyce had known her father. Most people in Laurel County had known her father. This kept surprising Margaret, not that he was known, but the particular way people said it, with something that sounded like relief, as if a thread that had gone slack was taut again. Gerald told her later that winter, over coffee in her kitchen, he had started stopping by on his rounds through the county, which she suspected was not strictly necessary, but which she did not discourage, that her father had talked about her in their conversations over the years. That he had said she was the one who stayed, not as a complaint, Gerald said, and not as a burden he had placed on her. He said Robert had said it the way you say something that is simply true. She stayed, and the rest of them didn't, and that mattered, and he was going to make sure it mattered in the right direction. Gerald said he thought Robert had always meant to tell her himself. Gerald said he thought the letter was the version of that conversation that Robert Hale could actually manage to have. Margaret sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "That sounds like him." It did. Exactly like him. Do the thing. Let the field speak. Trust that someone will be paying attention. The first year's harvest of the Bloody Butcher corn, the oldest of her father's 6 varieties, named for its deep crimson kernels, grown continuously on Hale land since at least 1919, came to 430 pounds of dried grain. She kept 200 pounds for seed stock. The rest she had peat mill. The meal was dark and fine and smelled, when you opened the bag, the way she imagined the county had smelled 100 years ago, which she could not explain precisely, but which felt true. She sold it at the farmer's market in Millhaven, and it was gone by 10 o'clock on the first Saturday. She was back the following week with more. A woman who ran a bakery in Athens drove up to talk to her. A chef from Columbus sent an email. Things began to move in the quiet, accumulating way that things move when they are built on something real. Some things in this life are not left in obvious places. They are tucked behind stone walls in the cellars of buildings no one thought to include in the paperwork. They are waiting for someone who has the right key and the patience to use it. What Margaret Hale's father had built for her could not be sold out from under her, and could not be split 2 to 1, and could not be summarized in a sentence. It was seeds and soil, and the kind of knowledge that only accumulates when someone spends 30 years paying close attention to one small piece of the world. It was, in its way, the longest letter he had ever written her, and she had spent the rest of her life learning to read it. She was 56 when her brothers took the house, and she had nothing. By 58 she had the mill house, and the back field, and a seed collection that a university wanted to study, and a small business that was growing the way good things grow, without hurry, from the roots up. She had a blue mug with an imperfection in the lip that she used every morning. She had Patty Greer coming for coffee on Sundays, and Gerald stopping by in the fall to check on the corn plots, and Pete's wife leaving a jar of tomatoes on the porch railing once in a while without saying anything about it, and Margaret leaving a bag of beans in return, also without saying anything, which was the way her father had done everything, and which she understood now was not silence, but a different kind of language, the language of people who let the work speak, who trust that someone nearby will be paying attention. She still had $41 in her checking account on the day she found the cellar room. She thought about that sometimes. $41, and a key she did not understand yet. That was all it had taken, at the end of it, the right door, and the right key, and someone who did not let herself be convinced that what she had was worthless. If this story found you at the right moment, we hope it stays with you. Subscribe if you haven't. We're here every week with stories like this one, and we'd love to ask you something real in the comments. Was there ever a moment when someone told you that what you had wasn't worth much, and you found out they were wrong? We'd genuinely like to know. Tell us about it. Thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next one.